Everybody lives on a street, in a city or a village or a town for what it's worth. And they're all inside a country which is part of a continent.
We actually live on 7 continents and 193 countries as recognised by the United Nations.
That sits upon a planet known as Earth. And the Earth is a ball full of oceans and some mountains which is out there spinning silently in space.
The Earth doesn't just spin silently in space, it orbits the Sun at the same time. What is accurate here is that space is actually silent, as there are no atoms or molecules that can carry sound waves.
And living on that Earth are the plants and the animals and also the entire human race. It's a great big universe and we're all really puny. We're just tiny little specks about the size of Mickey Rooney.
Mickey Rooney was 5 feet 2 inches tall or 157 centimetres tall when he died in 2014. The average global human height is significantly taller for men and slightly taller for women. For men it is 5 feet 9 inches or 175 centimetres, and for women it is 5 feet 4 inches or 162 centimetres.
It's big and black and inky, and we are small and dinky. It's a big universe, and we're not. And we're part of a vast interplanetary system stretching 700 billion miles long.
There are several ways to define the size of our solar system. If we define the solar system as being the distance from the Sun to Neptune, that's about 2.8 billion miles, significantly below Yakko's number of 700 billion miles. Another definition is the distance from the Sun to the dwarf planet Sedna, which at its furthest distance from the Sun is 87 billion miles. And one final definition is from the Sun to the edge of the Oort cloud, which is a theoretical cloud of icy planetesimals, which is about 2 light years in radius. This is equal to about 12 trillion miles, well above Yakko's estimate. There is no one definition of the size of our solar system that astronomers can agree on, so I'm going to leave this one up for debate.
With 9 planets.
At the time of this song's airing in 1993, the solar system did have 9 planets. However, in 2006, Pluto was redefined as a dwarf planet, so there are now 8 planets in the solar system as of 2023.
The Sun, we think the Earth's the only one that has life on it, although we could be wrong. Across the interstellar voids are a billion asteroids, including meteors.
The number of asteroids in our solar system is much lower than Yakko's estimate. About 1 to 2 million that are larger than 1 kilometre in diameter. Also, a meteor is defined when a meteoroid enters the Earth's atmosphere. If a fragment of a meteor survives re-entry and lands on Earth, it is called a meteorite. Most meteorites have originated from the asteroid belt, while some have originated from near-Earth objects.
And Halley's Comet too.
Halley's Comet did not originate from the asteroid belt. It is believed to have originated from the Kuiper belt. Others believe it originated from the Oort cloud. I also pronounced the comet as Halley's Comet, while Yakko pronounced it as Halley's Comet. The name actually has 3 pronunciations. The other, lesser known one is Halley's Comet.
And there's over 50 moons floating out there like balloons.
They don't float like balloons, but they orbit other planets. As of 2023, the solar system has nearly 300 moons.
In a panoramic trillion-mile view. And still it's all a speck amid 100 billion stars in a galaxy we call the Milky Way. It's 60,000 trillion miles from one end to the other.
This distance is equal to about 10,000 light years, and the diameter of the Milky Way is 100,000 light years.
And still that's just a fraction of the way. Cause there's 100 billion galaxies that stretch across the sky, filled with constellations, planets, moons, and stars. And still the universe extends to a place that never ends.
It is currently unknown if the universe is actually infinite in size. The diameter of the observable universe is 93 billion light years. However, the universe is expanding, and this is just the distance that scientists and astronomers have been able to observe so far, hence why it's called the observable universe. Advances in technology will allow this number to grow even larger.
Which is maybe just inside a little jar.
The universe is not inside a little jar. And there are no more inaccuracies, so let's move on to the next show.
As the Earth orbits around the Sun, it spins, making one full rotation every 24 hours. That means the Earth rotates at 30 kilometres a second.
The Earth orbits the Sun at 30 kilometers per second, but the speed at which the Earth rotates is more than 60 times slower. At the equator, the Earth rotates at 465.1 meters per second and decreases as you get closer to the poles.
On the 20th of July 1969, Neil Armstrong was the first man to walk on the moon.
The only inaccuracy I can find here is that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon on the 21st of July, not the 20th.
The Apollo 11 mission was a major achievement.
This is true, however the astronauts had to spend 3 weeks in quarantine on their return, as there wasn't enough evidence that the moon was barren of life.
With a surface temperature of 6,000 degrees Celsius, a trip to the sun is too hot to handle for all but the best protected space probes.
What you see on screen now is the Ulysses space probe, which launched in 1990 on a space shuttle on a mission to study the sun's poles. Since then, more space probes have been launched to study the sun further. The two most notable ones are the Parker Solar Probe and the Solar Orbiter, which were launched in 2018 and 2020 respectively, and they are much more protected against the sun's heat than the Ulysses probe was,
boosting its temperature to 470 Celsius. That's hot enough to melt lead.
This temperature is also hot enough to melt zinc, which has a melting point of 419 degrees Celsius.
Far from the sun, its temperatures plummet way below zero.
The temperature on Mars can range from 20 degrees Celsius, or 70 degrees Fahrenheit, to minus 153 degrees Celsius, or minus 225 degrees Fahrenheit.
Jupiter is the biggest planet in the solar system. It's made up of swirling gases under enormous pressure. Tremendous storms constantly sweep across its surface.
Jupiter is a gas giant and does not have a solid surface. This is also true for Saturn, Uranus and Neptune.
Uranus is much colder. It's an icy minus 200 Celsius. Not a place to visit unless you have to.
I wouldn't really describe Uranus as a place to visit unless you have to, given that Voyager 2 is so far the only space probe to visit Uranus. There have been proposals to revisit the planet from space agencies around the world, but so far as of 2023, none have been approved.
Neptune, the final gas planet, is colder still.
The coldest planet in the solar system is actually Uranus, not Neptune. The average temperature of Uranus is about minus 225 degrees Celsius, while the temperature on Neptune is about 10 degrees warmer at about minus 215 degrees Celsius.
Further past Neptune is the smallest planet, Pluto, which we know least about. It's so far away that no space probe has ever reached it.
This episode of Scientific Eye aired in 1997, and at the time no space probe actually visited Pluto, but in 2006 NASA launched the New Horizons space probe, which visited Pluto in July 2015. Also in 1997, Pluto is still classed as a planet, but in August 2006, 7 months after the launch of New Horizons, Pluto is reclassified as a dwarf planet by the International Astronomical Union. And thanks to New Horizons, we know a lot more about Pluto than we did 25 years ago. Here, Pluto looks a lot like the planet Mercury and has 2 day sides and 2 terminator lines. This is incorrect, as the closest star to Pluto is the Sun, and thus Pluto should only have 1 day side and 1 night side. What is accurate here though is that in 1997 Pluto was known to have 1 moon, which you can see in the upper right. The eagle-eyed among you may have also noticed a second moon to the lower left of Pluto when the camera zoomed in. In reality, before the launch of New Horizons, only 1 moon was discovered orbiting Pluto, and on the way to Pluto, New Horizons discovered a further 4 moons, bringing the total to 5. Only 1 of Pluto's 5 moons is large enough to be round and should be much larger than what you see here. And that's all the inaccuracies from there as well, so let's move on to the last show.
I always wanted to be an astronaut, like Lance Armstrong.
It's Neil Armstrong.
He lied about his name, too?
Lance Armstrong and Neil Armstrong are 2 different people, and they're also not related. Lance Armstrong did not cycle under a different name. There are three things wrong with the design of this space shuttle. First, the American flag was actually located on the shuttle's right wing, not the left wing. And the letters USA were not even on the space shuttle. The NASA worm logo shown here was actually located on the shuttle's left wing, and in the late 90s and early 2000s it was replaced with the meatball logo. The name of the orbiter is missing, and would have been located just above the American flag.
Wow, this is amazing, Chris.
The Griffin seemed to be defying gravity here. Since the shuttle was vertical on the launch pad, the ladder would have actually been on the floor, meaning that astronauts did not climb up the ladder to the flight deck before launch.
Look at this, Lois. A week ago, we called him stupid, and now he's giving tours of the space shuttle.
It's not really a tour, since the only floors that are on the space shuttle are the flight deck and the mid-deck. Defying gravity here as well. The astronauts wouldn't just simply walk to their seats. The astronauts would need a bit of help getting to their seats as they were facing upwards when the shuttle was vertical on the launch pad.
So do you know how all this stuff works?
Well, I don't know what most of these buttons do, but
An astronaut would need to train for thousands of hours before flying the space shuttle, and thus they would need to learn what every single button and knob does on the flight deck.
I know this big red one is the one you press to launch.
This button did not exist on the space shuttle at all. Every shuttle launch was automated by its onboard computers. Mission Control in Houston, which is nearly 900 miles away from the Kennedy Space Center, would program these computers to tell the shuttle what orbital inclination it needs to be at, the main engine cutoff altitude, and when to initiate the roll program, just to name a few.
Uh-oh.
Chris, make it stop!
Unlike previous launch vehicles used by NASA during the Mercury, Gemini and Apollo programs, the space shuttle did not have a launch escape system, or indeed any way for the crew to escape in the event of an emergency. Space Shuttle Columbia actually had ejection seats on the flight deck during its first 4 missions, but these were never used, and they were removed after Columbia's 6th mission, STS-9, in 1983. There were also options to remove the crew cabin altogether, but this was considered to be too complex. An abort on the launch pad after the auto sequence start has only happened 5 times in the entire history of the Space Shuttle program, the most recent being STS-68 in 1994.
I'm trying!
The gaseous oxygen vent arm, commonly known as the beanie cap, was retracted just under 3 minutes before the launch.
I think we're launching.
You are launching, and you should have been strapped into your seat 2 to 3 hours before the launch. Also note that throughout the launch and landing, the family are not wearing pressure suits, which were a requirement for all space shuttle crews after the Challenger disaster in January 1986.
Oh my god, everyone strap yourselves in! Stewie, hold my hand!
There are several things wrong here. First, the flight deck of the space shuttle only had room for 4 astronauts, not 6, and the flight deck is actually much smaller than what you see here. Secondly, astronauts and cosmonauts did not hold hands on the space shuttle during the launch. The maximum acceleration experienced during a space shuttle launch is 3 Gs, or 3 times the force of Earth's gravity, which would make it difficult to even lift your hand off your knee. There were no dogs on the space shuttle either. Stewie is age 1 in the show, but the youngest astronaut to fly on the space shuttle was age 32.
If this is what it takes to get out of Florida, fine.
Nope, they would actually land right back in Florida, as you'll see later.
You know what? You only live once. I am sticking my head out the window.
The windows on the flight deck could not be opened. If they were opened, this would cause the crew compartment to depressurise, which would kill the entire family, unless they wore pressure suits.
Mom, I'm scared.
Meg has actually been into space before, in a cutaway from 2 episodes ago, and she wasn't scared then.
I don't believe it. Are we really stuck in space?
Oh God, what if we have to live up here for the rest of our lives?
The average space shuttle mission has about 3 to 4 weeks of consumables and air, so the family have plenty of time to find their way home. It is not possible for someone to lift an entire house up and move it from one location to another. The space shuttle's airlock was actually located in its payload bay.
Wow, neat. So this is space.
This is not what the Earth looks like from low Earth orbit. The Moon and the Sun are far too close. Also, the Sun's light is white from space, not red or orange. Astronauts on spacewalks could not use their mobile phones because their touchscreens wouldn't work. The battery wouldn't last long either.
Brian, check it out. Meg's poking around the cargo hold. I'm gonna give her a little scare.
The cargo hold, better known as the payload bay or cargo bay, was not pressurised, so Meg would need to be wearing a spacesuit here. Also, no space shuttle mission has ever launched with an empty or almost empty payload bay. The payload bay doors would actually remain open for almost the entire time the space shuttle was in orbit. And this is why the payload bay is not pressurised.
Peter, that's a fecal collection bag.
Oh, there's a bag for that?
The space shuttle actually had its own toilet on the middeck, known as the waste collection system or waste management system, making collection bags unnecessary.
If we don't get this shuttle out of orbit soon, we're gonna run out of oxygen and die.
As before stated, the shuttle has enough consumables and air for a 3 to 4 week mission, giving them plenty of time to figure this out.
Is failure an option?
No, it's not.
Apollo 13 reference.
Okay, try this. Hit up, down, left, right, BA, start. Then we'll have unlimited lives.
This is a reference to the Konami cheat codes, and no, they do not have infinite lives.
Come on, we're running out of time.
As previously mentioned, no they're not.
In space camp, we learned about countering forward momentum with retro rockets. If we use them now, the ship might slow down enough for gravity to pull us out of orbit.
The space shuttle did not have retro rockets. The deorbit burn was done using the 2 orbital manoeuvring system engines on either side of the shuttle's tail. Again, the family are not wearing pressure suits for the landing. There are several things wrong with this landing. In reality, this landing would take about a minute from main gear touchdown to wheel stop. The drag chute was also cut from the shuttle's tail shortly before wheel stop. It would not stay on the shuttle as you see here. You will also notice in a few seconds that the space shuttle actually landed facing away from the Kennedy Space Center. This means they are landing at runway 33. And finally, the shuttle is not powered down after the landing, which was part of the entry checklist. The space shuttle in reality did not land this close to the vehicle assembly building.
Well, thanks to no gravity in space, my spine stretched and I am now a confident 6'3".
Astronauts do grow taller rather in space, but only by about 3%. This is Peter's actual height, so what you just saw was a huge exaggeration. And that is all for this episode. If you guys have enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind in the future. Also leave a comment down below if I've missed something somewhere and let me know what shows you would like me to do next. And I will see you all next time. Adios!